Thank you. Ms. Weber, go ahead.
Yes, I want to thank Mr. Leno for bringing this forward, and really thank the advocates for the charter schools as well, and my colleagues for their comments. Most of you know I'm not you can't often predict how I'm going to fall on these issues, particularly with regards to charter schools, mainly because I find that the ongoing challenge of that exists between, I hate to call them regular schools and charter schools because all of them are regular schools, but the conflict that's there is almost becoming legendary in the dialogue that occurs. So when I look at issues like this, I try my best to try to figure out what's going to be best for students, much more than us old folks, and what's going to basically make the greatest amount of sense and the greatest impact on the lives of young people who are oftentimes victims of the decisions that we make here, based on things that aren't always correct and always clear in the direction we're going. Yeah, I consistently find the great challenge with charters almost lying at the local level in terms of school boards not fulfilling their full responsibility. They have the responsibility to deal with the issue of making charters. They have the responsibility of evaluating charters. They have the responsibility of coming down on the issues that are important so they don't work their way up to us here in Sacramento. And the guidelines and rules that govern charters are relatively clear. However, every now and then there is some conflict, or there's some issue that's there that if we don't address it appropriately, even though it's an administrative issue that ought to be addressed at the local level, to ignore it continues to allow students to suffer occasionally. And like in anything, one child suffering is more than we need to be. We have a serious problem in the state concerning suspensions and expulsions, period. And simply by pointing out the charters problem is one problem, and we recognize that in trying to solve it. We have a problem with the K-12 system, which we've tried for years to get rid of expulsions in terms of K-12 with regards to expulsions for children's, quote, attitude. And our current public school systems don't support that, and neither do our oftentimes teacher associations support our efforts to eliminate expulsions because a child has a bad attitude. And so we've seen that occurring over and over, and so we haven't adequately addressed the issue of expulsion and suspensions in the K-12 system. I would continue to hope that those who find it necessary to address this, and I think at some point it is, because I'm looking at how do we protect students. Well, I know it is not rampant, and there are a lot of issues about what's going to happen to the students, what's the economic issue in terms of putting a student out too soon or late or whatever it is, what happens to them for 30 days or 60 days, and how do we deal with that and where they're going to go. I think those are issues that have to be worked out with the charter and the school board in terms of the resources that the school board has that ought to be at some point responded to in terms of the interests of the students who may find themselves in a position where they've got to go through the due process, and it takes time to get those things done. But I'm going to vote with this today because I think at some point it does raise an issue that is important. It may not be as large as we think it is. I've heard of issues. I talked with some of my friends over the last couple of days who are in high schools who find themselves faced with young people who've been expelled from various charters who may not be as structured as some charters that I love in my district, but find themselves from wherever coming back into these schools. And they're not the only ones doing that. I want to emphasize that because one of the greatest challenges I had when I was on the school board was I had young people who were bussed out of my community to other communities. And once the so-called census data had occurred in October, where the schools had been allocated the resources, schools had gotten the Title I funds and everything else, then all of a sudden I found 40, 50 students standing back at my school saying they had been recommended to come home. They had been suspended or expelled in some informal method very quickly. And we found them back at the school door in the inner city schools that had been sent back, but the money didn't follow them. The money didn't come back, and so the schools had kept these young people for 30 to 60 days, whatever the census data period was, and we still had 40, 50 students coming back without the resources that followed them. Now, I remedied that, of course, by basically funding them for a half a year, and if you send them back, I want the other half of the money. But that was an ongoing challenge of how do we deal with these issues and students become the victims of our policies. They become the victims of either funding policies or issues or expulsions and suspensions and so forth and so on. And so because I have an aversion to a lot of suspensions and expulsions, period, and I believe in due process. I think parents have to have the right to have that due process. Our school board should be ensuring that in the policies and the charters that they make. They should be ensuring that there's due process. They should be ensuring that those processes and procedures are followed. And if they don't, as I keep saying over and over, we need to take away the power of these school boards to make charters and throw it to the state, because we cannot find ourselves constantly correcting these issues that ought to be handled at the local level. And if they're asking them to write policies concerning suspensions and expulsions, I would assume that all the school boards would be standing here saying, no, don't take away our power to have control. Don't take away our power to insist that our districts have, or that our charters have great policies, because we're doing that. I mean, they should be here testifying on behalf of the charters right now, rather than somehow punting it to us and allowing us to respond to it. And so it's an ongoing challenge, because the system was designed to make it function at the local level, so that all these pieces were there, all these questions were answered, and yet they're not being answered, and they're not being adequately addressed, and they're not being adequately implemented. So we find ourselves with your bill that is designed to protect the students. And that's why I say I fall on the side of this bill, because despite all the politics and the wrangling and, trying to kill charters, trying to keep charters, whatever the drama that goes on, as I keep telling you, when two elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers, and our children are the grass. And so I find myself once again with this battle going on, and I'm trying to snatch the kids from underneath the legs of the elephant to make sure that they don't get trampled and don't get misused and don't find themselves in positions where they're not being adequately cared for, they're not getting adequate due process. And so it's a very frustrating experience for me to constantly find myself in this position of Solomon, don't want to cut the baby in half, trying to save something alive, and recognize the fact that this is an ongoing challenge. And so, we're going to at some point have to visit the responsibility of local school boards, and whether or not they're doing adequate job in creating charters, implementing those charters, monitoring the charters, and holding those charters accountable, because that's why we did it that way. And if we find ourselves every time we turn around having to go back and correct something, we're just creating more convoluted policies. But at the same time, we can't ignore the fact that there are children who might not be getting due process, and they should have due process. And any one person without due process is one too many. And for me, and so as a result of that, in fairness to the students, I'm supporting the bill, because obviously there is an issue, there's a concern, but it should have been addressed at the local level, and that's my ongoing challenge. It should have been addressed at the school board level, and they should be the ones here standing up screaming. They would want to have their power. They want to make the charters. They want to hold them accountable. They want to decide who's in and who's out, because these children are in their district, and they should be fighting for their authority to control the charters, and yet they're not. And that is very, very concerning for me. I appreciate you bringing this issue forward. I don't appreciate everybody always putting us in this conflict, but it's there. I recognize it. And at some point, we're obviously going to have to address it and resolve it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Assemblywoman.
Thank you, Senator. This bill to me is about equal access and due process. It's that simple. So I appreciate it. And if you would close, please.
Thank you. I think you might have another member here.
We had one. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Thurman. Go.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually wanted to ask Mr. Martin if he could elaborate on. You were explaining that that this bill would create an additional financial burden for charter schools. I believe you were, and I'll be honest. I don't always think that creating an expense for something that has to be done is enough of a reason to not do the thing. But I do want to understand what it was, because I think it could be helpful for future conversations that we might have. And I say that prefacing something that most people don't know. I hate expulsions, period. As a school board member, I voted no every time a student was expelled. And here's why. Because typically there was no plan for how to help that student reenter the school that he or she was being expelled from, or some other school. And truthfully, I've met many students who have been expelled who didn't even know that they had a hearing to go to. Their families didn't even know. Almost every expulsion that I experienced in many districts, traditional public schools, I haven't had the chance to attend any hearings in a charter school, but in the traditional public schools, many of the students and families didn't even attend a hearing because they didn't know, and so they lost it. And I'm very sensitive to it. I objected to almost every expulsion hearing, because if we don't create a reentry plan for students to come back to the school or some school, then what are we doing? And so simply because I'm not familiar with how it happens in the charter public schools, I'd like to hear why the expense that you were describing, and what is the process if a student is expelled from a charter school. Is he or she able to go to another charter school in the same area, or do they get readmitted after a certain period of time? What is the process? How does it work? What are the options for the student and their family?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Thurman. In answer to your first question about the expenses and the costs, for those who don't know, who may be new to the legislature this year, charter schools are not covered by the mandate reimbursement process in California law. There was a mandate block grant adopted in the budget a couple of years ago. Everything that was a mandate at that point, we do get some reimbursement for, but every mandate that's adopted statutorily subsequent to that, and this would be a mandate, we would have to pay for. And if you look through the process that's enumerated in the bill, there are a lot of steps that we have to go through that we know that traditional school districts have to as well, but they get paid for it. So the hearing process, the subpoena serving, fees and mileage that have to be paid, perhaps finding an alternative program for the kid while the expulsion process is happening would be an expense to us. So all those things would add up. And you magnify that by the fact that the bill applies not just to what we all view as traditional expulsions, but also wherever a kid is leaving involuntarily from the charter school for something that has nothing to do with an expellable offense, but is still a reason for the kid to leave. That would still, the process would be implemented exactly like the process would be if the kid had brandished a firearm on campus. So those are the costs. In answer to your second question, the answer is myriad, because every charter school is going to deal with things differently. You heard Mr. Paz from Apex Academy talk about how many kids actually do come back to Apex, and that they pride themselves on the fact that one of the things that they do is deal with those really hard cases. And many of them do end up coming back. Many kids who leave, who end up being expelled from a charter school, the charter school works with the school district to find a placement for that kid because the school district has more options available to it. One of the things that bothers us about the implementation of this bill is we would have no place to put that kid in most cases because charter schools are just not big enough to have the range of alternative or options for a kid who's expelled, like a continuation school, like an independent study program. So those are some examples. With time, I could probably give you, many pages of examples of what happens to a kid. But everything is done to try to make sure the kid is put into an appropriate program.
Actually, I believe charter schools are reimbursed under the charter school block grant.
Yep.
So they are reimbursed for the expulsion activities. So they are reimbursed currently.
Okay, well it is lower. I can tell you that it's that what you get back is much lower.
Well, due process may not be cheap. I'm just telling you, it is reimbursed at this time.
Okay, well that's news to me, and we'll.
Mr. Thurman, I apologize. I just want to clarify that point.
No, I mean the questions are all in, and I was going to ask. Every for our district, every expulsion discussion in the board was closed session. So that's why I had to confess. I just hate these things, and I made all my board colleagues angry because I voted against them. I should have been on the board with you, Dr. Weber, because people didn't understand that it's not enough to just say a student has to go somewhere or go nowhere. We can't tell a student they have to go nowhere. So I'm glad we cleared up about there is some reimbursement. I understand there's some disagreement about how much is reimbursed, but my question to you was going to be, isn't it an option that if you said the charter schools will work with the school district to find school placements, couldn't that alleviate any of the additional costs if there is work together between the individual charter school and the school district to explore other school options for that student?
I think it's always fair to say that there are workarounds. We don't necessarily like laws that create situations where we have to find workarounds, but we're talking about that period of time that could be up to 80 days under the process in this bill where we would have to find an alternative educational program for that kid. Yeah, it may be that we can work out something with the district during that 80 days, but that's not always going to be the case and may not even be the case in the majority of situations. So we'd be responsible in most cases to make sure that kid was getting alternative programming.
I had intended to speak to a couple of principals of charter schools in my district about this. I didn't get a chance, but you've answered the questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no further comments from the committee,
Right. Otherwise, it's 40.
Senator, you may close.
Thank you.
And you may have something to add. I don't know.
Yes, a lot of information being floated around. I hope I can just address a number of them and briefly. So charter schools are here to stay. I'm here to make sure they're the best they can be so we can do the best for the students. And I appreciate Assemblywoman Weber's comments. This is about the students. And I would just have to ask, how many students are going to be expelled and suspended in a 5-year period awaiting a review? Let's just improve the process. First, let's acknowledge there's a problem, and then secondly, improve the process so that we can preempt the kinds of horror stories that we heard recounted earlier. They're happening. We know they're happening. We can do better. I thank you, Mr. Chair, for clarifying the question about expulsions and the block grants. As you know, there's the lag time between a mandate, the request for reimbursement, and then the decision by the Commission that it is reimbursable. And those that are on file have been reimbursed through the block grant. So those are on file. There was reference to 80 days. The way the bill's written is that the school only has 30 days to provide the hearing to the student and then 10 days to issue the option. That's 40 days. Now, it could be extended, that would be at the student's request, but otherwise, we're talking about 40 days. So, thank you for the full hearing. Thank you for the suggested amendment. And colleagues, thank you for your attention to this matter. I think we can all agree it's an important one. And it's heartbreaking to know that those who have the least resources, least access to language, are the families that are suffering the most. And I ask for your aye vote.
Thank you. Do we have a motion? It's been moved and seconded. Secretary, please call the roll.
The motion is due pass to appropriations. O'Donnell? Aye. O'Donnell, aye. Chavez?
No.
Chavez, no. Kim? No. Kim, no. McCarty? Aye. McCarty, aye. Santiago?
Thank you, sir.
Thurmond? Aye. Thurmond, aye. Weber?
Aye.
Weber, aye.
It's out. It has 4 votes.
4 votes. The bill is out. Thank you, Senator. We'll now move to file item number 5, SB, I believe it's 271 by Senator Gaines. If you come forward and give us 1 second, Senator. Go present a bill. It's your show.
Thank you. Senator Gaines, please present your bill.
There we go. Good afternoon, Chair and members. I would like to begin by accepting the committee amendments as author amendments. I bring to you today Senate Bill 271. This bill would make it an infraction to knowingly and intentionally fly unmanned aircrafts, popularly known as drones, up to 350 feet over a public school during school hours and during extracurricular activity. It would make it illegal to capture images of the school and the children during those hours. As drone technology gains popularity amongst the public, the potential for misuse and abuse will grow along with it. This bill has the sole intent of protecting our children from potential harm. This bill moved through the Senate and through the Assembly Privacy Committee and has received no votes. Here with me today is Robbie Montalban, Deputy Superintendent of the El Dorado County Office of Education.
Thank you. We are here. I'm here representing the El Dorado County Office of Education. We are in full support of this legislation. Our first and only thought at the beginning of every day is the safety of students, so that we can then go about the business of educating them. But without safety first, we have nothing. This language does protect the privacy of students and heads off any potentials for stalking kidnapping, and planning those sorts of activities. So we are in full support of this.
Thank you very much. Any others in support? No? I got a move by Ms. Weber and a second by Mr. Thurman. Are there any in opposition to the bill? Seeing none in opposition, going to the committee. Any questions? Would you please call the roll?
The motion is due pass to appropriations. O'Donnell. Chavez.
Aye.
Chavez, I. Kim. Kim, I. McCarty. McCarty, I. Santiago. Thurmond. Thurmond, I. Weber. Weber, I.
What's the vote?
It's 5.
Your vote's out 5-0.
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
very much, Senator.
I appreciate
I believe we have the consent calendar to go through. I move the consent from Ms. Weber and second by Mr. McCartney. Please call the vote.
Okay, do you want me to?
Yeah. The consent calendar.
SB 118 by Liu, due pass to appropriations. SB 148 by McGuire, due pass as amended to appropriations. SB 276 by Wolk, due pass to appropriations. SB 320 by Lara, due pass to appropriations. SB 436, Committee on Education, due pass to appropriations. SB 532, Leyva, due pass to appropriations. SB 645, Hancock, due pass to appropriations. SB 786, Allen, due pass as amended to appropriations.
Please call the vote.
O'Donnell. Aye. O'Donnell, aye. Chavez.
Aye.
Chavez, aye. Kim. Aye. Kim, aye. McCarty. McCarty, aye. Santiago. Thurmond. Thurmond, aye. Weber. Weber, aye. 6-0.
Yeah, this committee is adjourned.